Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the 2026 Pennsylvania gubernatorial election. We got some news yesterday that it seems likely that current Pennsylvania State Treasurer Stacey Garrity is likely to run against incumbent Democratic Governor Josh Shapiro. So now's a good time to check back in on this race and see where we are. I'm going to get right into it today. We're going to start by looking at the 2022 election, and then we're going to give some context on both Shapiro as well as Stacey Garrity, his likely Republican challenger. So in 2022, in case you don't remember, Josh Shapiro won decisively. It was by over 14.8% against Doug Mastriano, who is a state senator. Now, this on the surface seems like an unbelievably impressive performance, right? This is a state that is usually very close. Kamala Harris lost it in 2024. Biden narrowly won it in 2020. And here's Josh Shapiro winning by nearly 1 million votes, or 15% in Pennsylvania. Now, don't get me wrong. This says a lot about how good of a campaigner and messenger Josh Shapiro is. But there were a couple of things that helped him win by this much. First of all, national Republicans kind of gave up on this race. They didn't really see it as being competitive in the end. And by the fall, they were not investing in trying to beat Shapiro. They tossed that race to the side and focused on other races. Now, notably, and this is kind of part of why Republicans pulled out of Pennsylvania's governor race, Doug Mastriano was seen as a very extreme candidate. He was obviously he aligned himself closely with Trump's allegations of voter fraud in the 2020 presidential election. He was allegedly, or I think he actually was at the Capitol on January 6th. He didn't. I don't think he faced charges for that, but he was at the Capitol on January 6th, and he was also photographed in a Confederate military uniform. So he had a lot of baggage. From a pure electability standpoint, is definitely one of the weakest candidates Republicans fielded that year. And by the way, 2022 featured a lot of really unelectable Republican candidates in a lot of really important races. And Mastriano was probably one of the first that comes to mind whenever I think of the bad slate of candidates that Republicans had last midterm. Now, again, Shapiro winning by 15 in Pennsylvania, really impressive. He outran John Fetterman by 10, and John Fetterman didn't run against that great of an opponent either. But overall, this was a race that I think was more so shaped by Mastriano being a bad candidate and Republicans having no faith in him than Shapiro being a good candidate, even though both are true. Now, Shapiro, that being said, is a really strong incumbent. He has a mandate, obviously, from winning by this much in 2022, and he has a really high approval rating. He's one of the most popular governors in the country. He has a 65% approval rating on average, maybe a little lower than that, but it's in the mid-60s usually, despite the fact that he governs a state that voted for the opposite party last year. So he knows what he's doing, and I'd argue that he's one of the most skilled Democratic politicians in the country right now. He's pretty moderate. I would say he's definitely not one of the more progressive politicians, but I think he's been able to kind of play to both sides of the party while also having good numbers with with independent or unaffiliated voters. And then, of course, there are a fair number of Republican voters who seem to like Shapiro and how he's doing in Pennsylvania. So that makes him a pretty strong incumbent. But Republicans have been hoping to land Stacey Garrity as a challenger to Shapiro for a while now. And she seems to be getting ready to enter the race. And that's good news for Republicans, no doubt about it. And that kind of comes for two reasons. The first reason is that Doug Mastriano has actually teased running for governor again. If Mastriano were to run, I think he would lose. It would be similar to this. It would be really bad for Republicans, just to put it that way. I think Mastriano would make this race basically safe for Democrats, and that would obviously help Shapiro because he wouldn't have to worry too much about the race. But it would also, what it would do is it would hurt Republicans down ballot because he'd be a drag on the ticket. So first of all, Garrity running makes it seem as though Mastriano won't be the nominee, which will help Republicans kind of stay competitive, at least statewide in Pennsylvania next year. But more importantly, it really gives them a good candidate. Now, Stacey Garrity is the current treasurer of Pennsylvania, which is in the state or in the Commonwealth. They're very particular about that, which is a Commonwealth elected position. But it's also one that's really less known, right? And if you ask the average voter in any state, including Pennsylvania, they probably don't know a lot about their treasurer, even what the name of their treasurer is. In most cases, people usually tend to vote for treasurer based on two things: name recognition and party line. If they know one of the candidates' name better than the other, that candidate probably has an advantage, which is why spending and advertising in these down ballot races is really important. On the other hand, voters can often just vote on party. Maybe they are someone who is really, really unhappy with the current administration, so they really don't like Republicans right now. They just want to punish Republicans at every opportunity at the ballot box. They'll vote Democrat for treasury even if they know nothing about the Democratic candidate. So these races are often less about personal brands and more about other circumstances. But nonetheless, Joe Torsella, who was the former Democratic treasurer of Pennsylvania, won by a pretty good amount in 2016. It was a victory of well over 6%. And he was actually viewed as a pretty strong favorite, especially because he had a lot of fundraising, which is what I mentioned as being a really key factor here in 2020. Now, he actually lost. This was to the surprise of many forecasters. As you can see, he led in, every poll they released, and he ended up beating, Stacey Garrity ended up beating him by a little under a point. It was a very close race. But as you can see, this was not a race Republicans expected to win, and they ended up winning it because Garrity ultimately did run a good campaign. He was able to outrun Trump, especially in the suburbs in the Philadelphia region. Now, in 2024, Garrity kind of confirmed that she's a good candidate, and she won by 6%, so a similar margin to Torsella back in 2016 when she beat Erin McClelland, who was a lawyer, wasn't the best candidate for Democrats, wasn't super well known. It was widely expected that Garrity was going to win re-election, even if Kamala Harris won the state. But Garrity did better. She won by more than most people, including myself, anticipated. I thought she'd win by probably 3 or 4. She won by 6 points, which was quite impressive. And as you can see, she won a lot of swing counties, and she won a couple of, traditionally Democratic counties as well. So she only really lost, the area surrounding Pittsburgh, Scranton, and then the Philadelphia metro. She swept the rest of the state. So she's a good candidate, and she's been really good at winning treasurer races. But obviously that doesn't necessarily translate to, races in higher office like governor or especially senator. Now, that being said, I always want to say that because it's important to not, just take a race that's down ballot and then assume it'll work the same way in another race. But there is a bit of a trend here, right? And it's that in swing states, both parties want their candidates to be statewide officials. They don't want, there are exceptions, but usually you don't want to run a random state senator or a random mayor or like a random party official as your statewide candidate. And Democrats have this problem to an extent in Michigan. Republicans have this problem to an extent in North Carolina. But in Pennsylvania, the reason that Democrats felt good about the gubernatorial race in 2022 was that they kind of were banking on Shapiro's statewide experience coming in, kind of to help him. And so if you look at Shapiro's career, it's actually kind of similar to Stacey Garrity's. Shapiro was a local official in Montgomery County right here. He was elected the Attorney General of Pennsylvania on the same ballot as Trump, so he outran Hillary Clinton by around 4% that year, which is notable. He wasn't an incumbent, so it was a pretty good performance. He ended up winning. Then in 2020, he was the best performing Democrat in Pennsylvania by far. He won by nearly 5%, and this was, again, a year that Joe Torsella lost. This was a year that Joe Biden only won the state by 1%, and Shapiro was the best performing Democrat, like I said. He won all the swing congressional districts with the possible exception of the 10th, but back then that district was seen as a lot less swingy. But overall, it was a very, very, very good performance for Shapiro. And again, that's why Democrats were happy to run him for governor. They cleared the field for him. He had no primary challengers, and he won. So Garrity, on paper, is a good candidate for Republicans. Races are different the higher you go, but nonetheless, she's the best recruit. Now, the big question, of course, is can she win? And I'm going to say that this race is going to be still tricky for Republicans. But I want to make clear this is still good news for them, right? Politics, a lot of people will say it doesn't matter, who runs because they're not going to win, right? There's no point in running good candidates in races that are really hard to win. And first of all, the obvious flaw with that argument is that, I would say that if there are 100 races that you think are not close, maybe 1 or 2 of them will shock you, right? Every year we have a race that kind of, really shocks people, right? I remember in 2022, 538 gave Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez in Washington's 3rd District a 1% chance of winning, and she won because she was a good candidate, right? So it's still good to invest and run good candidates wherever you can. And by the way, Democrats are doing that in states like Iowa and Ohio. Even though they're not likely to win, they're still running best candidates they can. The other thing that is a lot more concrete for Republicans is that they have 3 really competitive House seats to defend in 2026. They have Scott Perry in the Harrisburg area. They have Susan Wild. She's the old representative for that seat. They have Ryan McKenzie in the kind of Allentown area, kind of between Philly and Scranton, kind of like the Lehigh Valley area. And then you have, obviously, Rob Bresnahan in the 8th district, who knocked off Matt Cartwright last year. So they have 3 really competitive districts. It's going to be really hard for them to win those districts if they're losing statewide in the most important, because remember, there's no Senate race. So the most important statewide race for Pennsylvania next year is for governor, right? So they are going to want to at least be competitive statewide. They don't want to lose by 15 like they did in 2022, because in 2022, they lost all but one competitive House seat, and they nearly lost the other one too, right? So overall, Garrity might not win, but she will lose by a lot less than someone like Doug Mastriano would, or by a lot less than like a random, sacrificial lamb, so to speak. So what that means is that even if Garrity doesn't win, she's helping Republicans, because it's better to lose by 4 or 5 than by 14 or 15. But then, of course, the more interesting question is, can she win? And like I said, I don't think it's likely, but it's not 0% either. First of all, the Republicans do not benefit from the midterm turnout in Pennsylvania. They benefit in some states like Georgia and in North Carolina. But in the Rust Belt and in states like Pennsylvania, where Democrats do really well in the suburbs, there are a few swing states. Like, I think Pennsylvania is probably the swing state where Democrats benefit the most in midterms, because their base is super suburban and the Republican base is super rural and getting more and more low propensity, right? So if you look at the 2024 map, Kamala Harris did really poorly compared to Democrats in the past in areas like Erie County, as well as rural Pennsylvania. She did okay in the Pittsburgh collar, I'll give her that, but she didn't do very well in rural Pennsylvania. She lost ground in Erie, and she did really poorly in this northeastern part. This is the competitive congressional district Republicans are going to have to hold next year, right? Lackawanna County, this is a county that I think Obama won by like 25 points. Harris won it by 3. Biden had won it by 9 points in 2020. I think 8 points in 2020, roughly. And then Harris also lost Monroe County, which was a historically pretty Democratic county. She lost Northampton County, which is a Democratic-leaning bellwether, and then she also lost Bucks County. This was very close. It was by, like, as you can see, 300 votes, so it wasn't anything that affected statewide. But Bucks County was won by Hillary Clinton even when she lost Pennsylvania. So across this kind of border with Jersey and New York area, and stretching into Lackawanna County, which is where Scranton is, Harris did really poorly. And obviously, she didn't do herself any favors in the city of Philadelphia either, which was a pretty good performance for Trump. But in the rest of the state, right, like in other blue areas, like in Pittsburgh, Harris held up fine. So there's a problem for Democrats there, and I think Republicans can take advantage of it. And again, if you compare this, it's pretty striking. Lackawanna County was won by Harris by 3. Shapiro won it by 24 against Mastriano. Or even go to Northampton and Monroe. Northampton, these are both marginal Trump counties. Shapiro won them by double digits in 2022. And so there's some room for Republicans to improve there. We're not, at this point, we're not sure if it's like these areas are just trending red or if it's a Trump effect. But Garrity can definitely play into that a little bit, and she can make up some ground there, because Republicans lost a lot of support here against Shapiro last time. I think Garrity can at least improve there. That'll help her get, cut into Shapiro's margin a fair amount. But like I said, the problem for Republicans in Pennsylvania is that the higher turnout parts of the state, wow, I can't talk today, are pretty blue. Chester County is a good example of this. This county voted for Mitt Romney by, I think a point in 2012. It's now pretty solidly Democratic. Kamala Harris, slipped a little bit here, right? This is an area that Biden won by around 17. She only won it by 15. Shapiro did really well here in 2022. So overall, Harris didn't do all that well here in 2024. But in the midterms, Democrats tend to do well here, and these are high turnout areas, which means that they'll turn out. Which means that the drop in turnout between the presidential and midterm will be smaller in these blue counties than it will be in like the red rural areas where there could be a bigger drop. So overall, that'll be pretty beneficial for Shapiro. But I think in terms of persuasion and vote switching, Garrity could be okay. Like I said, she'll probably run a lot better than Mastriano, especially in areas like the northeastern Scranton region and then down to Allentown. We'll see how she does. She did really well in her run for treasurer across the board, but she did especially well with working class voters who've been down ballot more Democratic leaning than at the presidential level. So we'll see, right? Like, can she be competitive in Erie County, which is a county that Trump won, but that Josh Shapiro won by like over 20%. So those are the questions that'll show whether it'll be a close race. I think as of right now, she'd probably lose by 5 to 8 points. It's kind of a wide range, but I think that At this point, we're still waiting to see how Shapiro runs a campaign. But the important thing, and this is something that's really underrated in politics, it's hard to predict, like, a year and 3 months out. But like a lot of times, politicians will fall asleep at the wheel. They'll think they're going to win. They don't really campaign until the last week, and they'll be like, well, we lost by 20,000 votes. That's literally what happened in the state last year with Bob Casey. By all accounts, Casey thought he was going to win. He didn't really campaign very much until the end of September. He got spooked by McCormick, who won by 0.2%. He won by, it was so avoidable. Casey should have won that race, right? And he lost because he didn't run that great of a campaign. He was out to lunch, right? The same thing, by the way, another Pennsylvania Democrat who I think a lot of people would argue did this. Joe Torsella thought he was going to win, especially during COVID year, kind of didn't really run that great of a campaign. He lost. It was close, but he lost. And then even go back to 2018, Bill Nelson, who's another Democrat who really, should have won his race. He lost by, I think, 10,000 votes out of like nearly, 9 million cast or something, right? So politicians fall asleep at the wheel more often than you think. Oftentimes they think they're going to win. Josh Shapiro, I'm not saying he's going to do that, but I think that's a way this race could get closer than people think. But overall, for now, until that happens, I'd bet on him winning. But nonetheless, this is good news for Republicans because it's important to be competitive in every possible race. So let me know what you think. Let me know if you think that Stacey Garrity has a chance to knock off Josh Shapiro, and I'll see you all next time.